The Forgotten World, the Galactic Council, had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, they had never once made a mistake worth remembering. At least that is what they told themselves. The council chamber floated at the center of the galaxy in a station so massive that entire civilizations could have lived within its walls and never met each other. 12 elder races sat at the great curved table that dominated the main hall, and each one believed themselves to be the pinnacle of evolution and progress. There was Thyvan of the Morith, hegemony whose people had mastered gravity itself and built cities that hung suspended between black holes. There was the Valori ambassador, whose crystalline body sang with frequencies that could shatter mountains or heal wounds depending on the harmony chosen. Kirik's delegate watched everything with 7 unblinking eyes, and her species had been conducting diplomacy since before most stars in the region had formed. These were the rulers of known space, and they had earned that position through patience and wisdom and the absolute certainty that they knew what was best for everyone. On this particular day, they were discussing the quarantine list. Species 472-9 requires reassessment, announced the automated system that managed their archives. Standard review period has elapsed. Ambassador Yethrin of the Valori pulled up the file with a wave of her translucent hand, and the information spread across the holographic display for all to see. "Ah, yes," she said, with a tone that suggested mild disgust. "The humans." The display showed a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, and an unfashionable arm of the galaxy. Images flickered past, showing the species in question, and the council watched with the detached interest of scientists observing bacteria. "They have progressed somewhat," Yethrin admitted. "Primitive computing technology now, and basic atmospheric flight and early nuclear capability." "Nuclear capability," repeated High Counselor Thyvan, with what passed for alarm among his species. "They have discovered atomic weapons and used them," Yethrin confirmed. Against each other. A ripple of discomfort passed through the chamber, because even the most warlike species present had never deployed nuclear weapons against their own kind. "Savages," muttered the drawn representative, whose people communicated through bioluminescent patterns that pulsed with contempt. "Perhaps," said the Kirik's delegate, whose name was too complex for most species to pronounce, so she simply went by 7. "But savages can evolve or destroy themselves," Thyvan replied, "which seems far more likely in this case." He gestured, and more images appeared showing human history in all its bloody glory, wars upon wars, stretching back through millennia, and empires rising and falling, and plagues and famines and cruelties that made even the battle-hardened Morith uncomfortable. "They cannot even achieve basic unity among themselves," Thyvan continued. "They fight over resources they have in abundance, and they kill over differences in belief, and they poison their own atmosphere while arguing about whether the poison is real. And yet," 7 interjected, "they also show remarkable creativity." She pulled up different images, now showing human art and music and literature, and the strange, persistent way they kept reaching for the stars, even when they had every reason to give up. "They went to their moon," she said, "using technology that by our standards is barely more advanced than a combustion engine. And they did it simply because they wanted to see what was there. Curiosity without wisdom." Yethrin dismissed. "A dangerous combination. All young species are dangerous." 7 replied, "We were all dangerous once." The chamber fell quiet at that, because it was true even if none of them liked to remember it. Every elder race had its dark chapters and its periods of chaos and violence before ascending to the enlightened state they now enjoyed. But that was different, they told themselves. That was necessary growing pain. The humans were just reckless. "What is your recommendation?" Thyvan asked Yethrin, since the Valori had been responsible for monitoring Earth. She considered for a long moment, her crystalline form humming with thought. Continued observation from a distance. She finally said, "No contact and no intervention." and no acknowledgement of their existence. And if they develop faster than expected, they will not. Yathrin said with absolute confidence, "Our models are quite clear on this point, and the humans lack the social cohesion necessary for rapid technological advancement. Their nations compete with each other constantly, and their resources are fragmented across hundreds of separate governments, and they cannot even agree on basic facts about their own planet. At their current rate of progress, it will take them at least 5,000 cycles to develop anything resembling interstellar capability. And by then," she added, "they will likely have destroyed themselves anyway." The Council voted unanimously to maintain Earth's quarantine status. The observation satellites were quietly repositioned to monitor more promising species on distant worlds, and a file on humanity was archived in the deepest sections of the database, where forgotten things went to gather digital dust. "A shame, really," Seven said as the session concluded. "I found them rather interesting." "Interesting is not the same as valuable," Thyvan replied. "The galaxy has no place for chaos. The galaxy is vast," Seven answered. "Perhaps it has room for more than we imagine." But no one was listening anymore because the matter was settled, and there were more important things to discuss. Trade agreements needed negotiation, and territorial disputes required mediation, and the endless bureaucracy of governing 1,000 worlds demanded attention. Earth faded from their thoughts like a dream upon waking, just another primitive world among millions, and just another species that would probably burn itself out before achieving anything worth noticing. They had made their assessment, and they had made their decision, and they were confident that they were right. The Galactic Council did not make mistakes after all. Meanwhile, on the small blue planet that had been so thoroughly dismissed, a young engineer named Maria Santos was staring at her computer screen. In the middle of the night, she worked at a radio telescope facility, and her job was to filter through the endless noise of space, looking for patterns that might indicate something other than natural phenomena. Most nights she found nothing, but tonight something was different. A signal had appeared in the data, and it was clearly artificial, and it was clearly not from Earth. Maria checked her equipment 3 times, because this had to be an error. It was not an error. "Hello," she whispered to the empty room. "Is someone out there?" She had no way of knowing that the signal was merely routine communication between 2 council monitoring stations, and that it had been carelessly broadcast on a frequency the humans could detect. She had no way of knowing that the great powers of the galaxy considered her species beneath notice. All she knew was that humanity was not alone, and that changed everything. Maria picked up her phone and began making calls, because some discoveries were too important to wait until morning. The Galactic Council had decided that Earth could be safely ignored. They were about to learn how wrong that assumption had been. The impossible arrival 40 years had passed since Maria Santos first detected the signal from the stars. 40 years of secrets and lies in the most ambitious project in human history, hidden beneath mountains and oceans and the vast deserts where no one thought to look. Governments that had been enemies learned to cooperate because some things were bigger than old grudges. Scientists who had spent their careers competing for grants found themselves working side by side in laboratories that officially did not exist, and slowly, piece by impossible piece, humanity built something that should not have worked. Ship was called the Stubborn Optimism because the engineer who named it had a sense of humor, and also because the name was accurate. It was ugly in a way that would have offended any species with a sense of aesthetics. Panels of different metals had been welded together wherever they would fit, and cables ran along the outside because there had not been room for them inside, and the whole thing looked like it had been assembled by people who were making up the rules as they went along, which was exactly what had happened. Captain Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of this magnificent disaster and tried to look confident for her crew. She was 53 years old, and she had spent the last 20 years of her life preparing for this moment. "Final systems check," she called out. Navigation is as ready as it will ever be, replied her navigator, whose name was James Chun and who had personally written most of the equations that would theoretically get them across the galaxy engines are holding together. Reported Chief Engineer Kofi Mensah from somewhere in the bowels of the ship. I would appreciate it if no one asked me how life support is functioning, added Dr. Yuki Tanaka, though I still recommend we all hold our breath just in case. Elena smiled because humor was how her crew dealt with the very real possibility that they were about to die in the most spectacular way imaginable. They had tested the drive exactly once, and it had worked, but no one could explain precisely why the mathematics said it should tear them apart at the molecular level. The mathematics was apparently wrong, or at least incomplete, mission control. Elena said into the communicator, "We are ready for departure. Back on Earth in a bunker deep beneath the Swiss Alps, a room full of people held their breath. The President of the United Nations Space Coalition, a title that had not existed 5 years ago, stood at the center of the chaos, looking far calmer than she felt. Captain Vasquez, she said, on behalf of humanity, I wish you good luck. Thank you, Madam President. Elena replied, we will try not to embarrass the species. She cut the communication and turned to her crew. You all know what we are about to attempt, she said. And you all know the odds. The odds are garbage, James said cheerfully. But when has that ever stopped us? We are humanity, Kofi added over the intercom. Being told something is impossible just makes us want to try harder. Elena nodded because there was nothing more to say. Engage the drive. What happened next would be debated by physicists for generations. The stubborn optimism did not accelerate in any conventional sense. Instead, space itself seemed to fold around the ship like paper, being creased by invisible hands. Stars stretched into lines of light, and then into something that human eyes could not properly process, and then everything went white for exactly 17 seconds. The crew experienced something that none of them could later describe. Some said it felt like being everywhere at once. Others said it felt like being nowhere at all. Kofi would later claim that he saw his grandmother, who had died when he was 12, and she had told him to stop working so hard and eat more vegetables, and then they were somewhere else. Warning alarms screamed throughout the ship, and Elena grabbed her console to keep from being thrown across the bridge. Report, she shouted. We are intact, James said with obvious surprise. All crew accounted for, and the hull is holding. Where are we? James checked his instruments, and then checked them again, and then laughed in a way that sounded slightly unhinged. We are exactly where we wanted to be, he said. Right in the heart of their territory. How do you know? Because there are 17 warships pointing weapons at us. The view screen flickered to life, and Elena saw them, ships of impossible beauty and terrifying power arranged in a formation that was clearly designed to vaporize anything that did not belong. Each one was larger than anything humanity had ever built, and each one was sleek and perfect in a way that made the stubborn optimism look like a child's art project. We are being hailed, announced Communications Officer Sarah Webb. Multiple frequencies and multiple languages, and they all seem to be asking the same question, which is, how the hell did we get here? Elena straightened her uniform and tried to look like someone who belonged in this situation. Open a channel, she said. Time to introduce ourselves. On the bridge of the lead warship commander, Veth of the Mora Third Fleet, was experiencing something his species had not felt in centuries. Confusion. His instruments told him that a ship had just arrived in the most protected space in the galaxy, using a method of travel that should not exist. His eyes told him that the ship in question looked like it had been built by enthusiastic amateurs with access to a junkyard. His training told him to open fire immediately because anything unknown was potentially dangerous. But something made him hesitate. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the sheer audacity of what he was witnessing, or perhaps it was the signal now coming from the strange vessel. broadcasting a message in badly accented galactic common that had clearly been learned from stolen transmissions. This is the Earth vessel Stubborn Optimism to Unknown Fleet. The message said, "We come in peace, and we would very much appreciate it if you did not shoot us. We have traveled a very long way, and our engineer says the ship might explode if we try to run, so fighting would be pointless anyway. We just want to talk." Veth stared at the view screen for a long moment. Then, he did something he had never done in 30 years of military service. He laughed. "Stand down weapons," he ordered his crew, "and inform the council that they have visitors. They will not be pleased." His second-in-command warned. "No," Veth agreed. "They will not be pleased at all." He looked at the ugly little ship floating defiantly among his warships and felt something that might have been respect, but I suspect, he added, that pleasing the council is not something these humans are particularly concerned about. He was right about that. The Galactic Council was about to receive the first uninvited guests in their entire history, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The uninvited guest captain, Elena Vasquez, had been waiting in the holding chamber for 6 hours, and she was starting to get annoyed. The chamber itself was impressive in the way that everything in this station seemed designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. The ceiling soared so high above her that she could barely see it, and the walls were covered in what appeared to be the history of galactic civilization, rendered in glowing symbols that shifted and changed when she was not looking directly at them. The chair they had given her was clearly designed for species with very different bodies, and she had given up trying to sit comfortably after the first hour. Instead, she paced back and forth across the floor, trying to burn off the nervous energy that threatened to overwhelm her. Her crew was still on the ship, surrounded by warships that could vaporize them. In an instant, her mission was to make contact with an alien civilization that had apparently decided humanity was not worth talking to, and she had exactly zero training in interstellar diplomacy because no one on Earth had ever needed such a thing before. No pressure. She muttered to herself. The door finally opened, and a being made entirely of light gestured for her to follow. She had seen many strange things since arriving here, but this was somehow the strangest. The being had no solid form that she could identify, and it simply existed as a pattern of luminescence that moved through the air with purpose. "The council will see you now," it said in a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. "About time," Elena replied. She followed the light creature through corridors that seemed to stretch and bend in ways that hurt her eyes. The station was so large that it had its own internal weather, and at one point she passed through a section where it was actually raining indoors. Finally, they reached a door that was larger than any door had a right to bait. Opened, and Elena walked into the presence of the most powerful beings in the known galaxies. Council chamber was circular, and the 12 representatives of the elder races sat in elevated positions arranged around the room so that anyone standing in the center wouldn't have to constantly turn to address them all. Elena recognized this for what it was, a power play designed to make her feel surrounded and vulnerable. She walked to the exact center of the room and stood there with her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that suggested she was exactly where she intended to be. "You should not be here," began the being she assumed was in charge, based on his position and the general air of importance he projected. His skin was a deep purple, and his eyes were solid black, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that she could feel in her bones. "And yet, here I am," Elena replied. "Your species was assessed and found wanting," the purple being continued. "You were placed under quarantine for your own protection and for the protection of the civilized galaxy. About that," Elena said, "we found your assessment file, and I have to say, we were not impressed with your methodology." A ripple of something passed through the chamber. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe outrage. It was hard to read alien facial expressions. "You accessed restricted council archives," said a crystalline being whose voice was like wind chimes in a storm. We accessed a lot of things, Elena admitted. 40 years is a long time to prepare, and we are very good at finding information the people do not want us to find. This is outrageous, declared a massive creature covered in scales whose species Elena could not identify. They should be removed immediately, and their ship should be destroyed as an example. An example of what exactly? Elena asked. That you are afraid of one? Small ship from a species you consider primitive. The scaled being made a sound that was probably a growl. We are not afraid of you, he said. Then why destroy us? Elena replied. Unless you have something to hide. We hide nothing, the purple being interjected. We simply maintain order in the galaxy, and order requires rules. And one of your rules is that species like mine do not get a seat at the table, Elena said. Even though we clearly have the capability to travel between stars and the intelligence to decode your communications and the determination to show up uninvited when you ignore our existence. She looked around the chamber meeting, each set of alien eyes in turn. I am not here to beg for acceptance, she continued, and I am not here to apologize for existing. Then why are you here? Asked a being with 7 eyes who seemed more curious than hostile. Because we intercepted something else in your communications, Elena said. Something that worried us very much. You mentioned a threat called the Hollow. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop by several degrees. The casual dismissiveness vanished from the faces of the council members and was replaced by something that looked very much like fear. That information was encrypted, the purple being said slowly. Yes, it was, Elena agreed. And it took our best minds 3 years to crack that encryption, but we managed. We know that something is coming, she continued. Something that has been destroying your colonies and consuming your fleets and spreading across the galaxy like a disease. We know that you have been fighting it for centuries, and we know that you are losing. The silence that followed was absolute finally. The 7-eyed being spoke. You know about the Hollow, she said. Then you know why we cannot afford to waste resources on species that may not survive. What is coming? I know that you have been fighting this enemy with the same strategies for hundreds of years, Elena replied, and I know that it has not worked. What would you suggest? The purple being asked with obvious skepticism. That we ask primitives for military advice, I would suggest, Elena said carefully. That may be the reason you keep losing, is because you keep thinking like civilized beings. She stepped forward, and the guards around the room tensed but did not move. The Hollow does not care about your rules, she said. It does not respect your protocols, and it does not fight fair. And neither do we. Humanity has spent its entire existence fighting enemies stronger than ourselves, she continued. We have survived ice ages and plagues and wars that should have destroyed us. We are still here because we learned that when you cannot win by conventional means, you change the game entirely. You are offering to help us. The 7-eyed being asked. I am offering to show you a different way of fighting, Elena replied. One that your enemy has never encountered, because no civilized species would ever think of it. And what do you want in return? Elena smiled, and it was not entirely a friendly expression. A seat at the table, she said. Recognition that humanity exists and has a right to exist. And when this is over, and the Hollow is defeated, we want to be treated as equals, not as pets or projects or problems to be managed. The council members looked at each other, and silent communication passed between them in ways that Elena could not follow. You ask for much, the purple being finally said. I am offering everything, Elena replied. My people do not do anything halfway. If we help you fight this war, we will give you everything we have. Our creativity and our stubbornness and our complete inability to accept that anything is truly impossible. She stood in the center of the most powerful room in the galaxy, and she did not flinch. So what do you say? She asked. Do you want to keep losing the civilized way, Or do you want to try winning the human way? The council would debate for 3 more days before reaching a decision. But, standing in that chamber, watching the expressions on 12 alien faces, Elena knew that she had already won. They were afraid, and they were desperate, and they were running out of options. And humanity had just become the option they could not afford to ignore. What humanity brought the briefing room was cold, and the information displayed on the screens was colder. Elena sat with her senior crew members as the council's military commanders explained exactly what humanity had volunteered to fight the Hollow. Had no face and no voice and no demands. It simply consumed. The first attack had occurred 800 years ago, when a thriving colony on the edge of known space went silent. Ships sent to investigate found nothing but an empty world where millions had once lived. No bodies and no ruins and no evidence of battle. Just emptiness where life had been. We thought it was an anomaly, explained General Veth, who had escorted them to the station, and who seemed to have developed something like respect for the humans under his watch. By the time we understood the pattern, it had already taken 17 worlds. The display showed a map of the galaxy with red markers indicating lost territory. The markers formed a spiral pattern slowly closing in on the heart of civilization. What is it exactly? Asked James Chun, who was taking notes on everything because knowledge was the only weapon they had brought. We do not know, Veth admitted. Our scientists have studied it for centuries, and we still do not understand its nature. It appears to be some form of energy-based life that exists between dimensions, added a Vylori scientist whose name was Crystalline Harmony and who was apparently considered the leading expert on the Hollow. It enters our reality at specific points and spreads outward, consuming all organic and inorganic matter until nothing remains. Then it moves on. Can it be killed? Elena asked. Unknown, Harmony replied. We have deployed every weapon in our arsenal against it. Nuclear weapons and antimatter, bombs and devices that manipulate the fundamental forces of the universe. Nothing has worked. Nothing has worked. Kofi repeated slowly. Oh, nothing has worked well enough. The aliens looked at him with confusion. There is a difference, he explained. If your weapons have absolutely no effect, then fighting is pointless. But if they have some effect, even a small one, then maybe the answer is not better weapons, but different tactics. Our tactics are sound, insisted a Morath commander whose scales bristled with offense. We have fought wars for 10,000 years, against enemies who think like you do, Elena said. Enemies who follow rules and patterns that you can predict and counter. This thing does not think like you. She stood and walked to the display, gesturing at the spiral pattern of destruction. You have been fighting a defensive war, she said, waiting for it to attack and then trying to stop it. What happens if you attack first? We have tried, Veth said. Our fleets have engaged the Hollow at its point of emergence dozens of times. The results have been, he paused, searching for the right word, educational. We learn what does not work and then we watch our ships die. Show me, Elena said. The next several hours were spent reviewing footage of battles that should never have been lost. Elena watched as the most advanced warships in the galaxy unleashed firepower that could crack planets, and she watched as the Hollow absorbed it all and kept coming. She watched organized formations dissolve into chaos as crews panicked and commanders lost control. She watched disciplined soldiers break and run when they realized that nothing they did mattered, and she started to understand. You fight with honor, she said finally. Of course, Veth replied as if this was obvious. You announce your presence, and you engage directly, and you give your enemy the chance to respond. That is how civilized warfare is conducted. Elena looked at her crew and saw that they had reached the same conclusion she had. That is your problem, she said. Honor, Veth asked. Civilization, Elena replied. She pulled up a file from the Stubber Optimism's database and sent it to the main display. Images of human warfare filled the screens. Not the grand battles that nations like to commemorate, but the other kind. Guerrilla fighters hiding in jungles and striking without warning resistance. Movements sabotaging enemy supply lines from the shadows. Soldiers who knew they could not win a straight fight, so they refused to fight straight. Where I come from, Elena said, we have a saying. If you find yourself in a fair fight, your tactics are wrong. The aliens stared at the images with expressions that ranged from confusion to disgust. This is not warfare, the Morith commander said. This is cowardice. This is survival. Elena corrected. Every species on my planet has had to learn how to fight enemies bigger and stronger than themselves. The ones who played fair died. The ones who cheated lived. She let that sink in for a moment. You have been fighting the Hollow, like it is an enemy that can be defeated through superior firepower. She continued, but it is not that kind of enemy. It does not care about your fleets or your weapons or your honor. So stop giving it what it expects. What do you propose? Asked Crystalline Harmony, whose scientific curiosity seemed to outweigh her cultural discomfort. I propose we stop trying to destroy it directly, Elena said, and start trying to confuse it. She outlined a plan that made the military commanders physically uncomfortable. Instead of engaging the Hollow with organized fleets, they would use small fast ships that struck randomly and retreated before any counterattack could form. Instead of trying to overpower it, they would try to overwhelm it with unpredictable stimuli from multiple directions at once. Instead of fighting the war they were expected to fight, they would fight a completely different war that no one had ever seen before. This is madness, the Morith commander declared. Yes, Elena agreed cheerfully. It absolutely is. And that is exactly why it might work. The debate that followed lasted for hours as the council's representatives argued about tradition and honor and the proper way to conduct warfare. But in the end, it was Seven, the Kirik's delegate, who spoke the words that settled the matter. We have fought the Hollow with wisdom for 800 years, she said, and we have lost. Perhaps what we need now is a little madness. The vote was not unanimous, but it was enough. Humanity would be given ships and resources and the chance to prove that their chaotic approach to warfare had value. Elena thanked the council and returned to her crew and allowed herself one moment of quiet terror at what she had just agreed to do. Well, Captain, James said, you just convinced an ancient civilization to let us lead them into battle. No pressure, right? Elena laughed because it was better than screaming. We are humanity, she said. No pressure has ever stopped us before. Now let us show these people how to fight dirty. The uninvited war. 18 months of preparation had led to this moment. Theson's system hung in space like a jewel with its 3 inhabited worlds and massive shipyards representing the industrial heart of the Galactic Council. 2 billion souls lived here, and they were about to become the Hollow's next meal. Elena stood on the bridge of her new flagship. The defiant persistence, which was larger than the stubborn optimism, but just as ugly. She had insisted on that humanity's fleet of 50. 3 ships had been built using Council technology and human design philosophy, which meant they were powerful and fast and looked like they had been assembled by someone having a very creative nightmare. The crews were mixed with human officers, commanding alien soldiers who had volunteered for what most considered a suicide mission. They had trained together for over a year, learning to think in ways that made traditional military strategists weep with frustration. The Hollow has entered the system, announced James from his position at the sensor station. Same pattern as always. It is emerging from dimensional space at the outer edge and spreading inward. Elena watched the display as a darkness that was somehow visible began to unfold. Like a flower made of nothing, it was beautiful in a horrible way, and she understood why so many crews had frozen when facing it for the first time. All ships report ready, Sarah called out. They are waiting for your order, Captain. Elena took a deep breath. Everything they had planned and everything they had argued for came down to this moment. Execute Operation Chaos Theory, she said. What happened next would be remembered in the histories of a dozen species as the moment everything changed. The human fleet did not form up in defensive positions, like every fleet before them. Instead, they scattered in what appeared to be random directions, firing weapons in random intervals at random targets. Some ships accelerated toward the hollow, while others fled in apparent panics. Some broadcast signals on every frequency, while others went completely silent. To any observer, it looked like complete organizational collapse to the hollow, which had consumed hundreds of fleets that behaved in predictable patterns. It was something entirely new the entity paused in. 800 years of steady expansion, it had never once hesitated. But something about this chaotic swarm of tiny ships made it uncertain in ways it had never experienced. Phase 2. Elena ordered from hidden positions throughout the system missiles launched carrying payloads that Council scientists had declared useless. They were not weapons in any traditional sense. Some carried nothing but light and sound designed to overwhelm sensory perception across multiple dimensional frequencies. Others carried chunks of matter compressed to near impossibility that exploded into micro black holes, lasting only microseconds but creating gravitational havoc. Still others broadcast music, because Dr. Tanaka had theorized that organized sound might disrupt whatever passed for the hollow's consciousness. It was a theory based on nothing but human intuition and desperation. It worked. The hollow recoiled as reality itself seemed to stutter. Around it, the darkness that had been spreading steadily toward the inhabited worlds suddenly contracted, pulling back toward its point of origin. It is retreating, James said with disbelief in his voice. It is actually retreating. Do not let up, Elena commanded. All ships continue harassment pattern. The next 6 hours were a nightmare of close calls and desperate maneuver. Ships darted in and out of the hollows reach, delivering their chaotic payloads and escaping before retaliation could find them. Not all of them escaped. The destroyer, angry pacifist, was caught in a dimensional fold and simply ceased to exist, taking 47 souls with it. The cruiser, questionable decisions, lost power at the worst possible moment and drifted into the darkness. Before rescue ships could reach it, 26 vessels were destroyed, and over 1,000 humans and aliens died in the swirling chaos of battle. But they kept fighting, and more importantly, they kept confusing. Every time the hollow adapted to one attack pattern, the fleet shifted to something completely different. Every time it seemed to understand what was happening, the humans introduced some new element of randomness, and slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. Captain, called out Commander Yethrin, who had volunteered to serve on a human ship because she wanted to understand these strange creatures. The hollow is withdrawing completely. It is retreating from the system. Elena stared at the display, watching as the darkness folded back into whatever dimension it called home. For 600 years, no force in the galaxy had made the hollow retreat, and now it was running from a fleet of ugly ships crewed by a species that had been dismissed as primitive savages. All ships stand down, Elena ordered. Begin search and rescue operations for survivors. She sat heavily in her command chair, suddenly exhausted beyond words. We did it, James said quietly. I cannot believe we actually did it. We did not defeat it, Elena replied. We just convinced it that we were not worth the trouble. For now, Kofi added over the internal com. It will be back, and next time it will have learned from this. Then we will learn too, Elena said. That is what humans do in the aftermath of the battle. Rescue ships pulled survivors from damaged vessels, while repair crews worked miracles to save ships that should have been lost. Counselor Theven traveled personally to the Thesan system to witness the evidence with his own eyes. He found Captain Vasquez standing on an observation deck, watching the recovery operations, with a medic treating the cuts on her face from where a console had exploded during the battle. Your people are insane, He said, "Absolutely." Elena agreed without looking away from the viewport. "But we won. You lost half your fleet, and you kept 2 billion people alive." She finally turned to face him, and there was something in her eyes that made one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy take a small step backward. For 12,000 years, your council decided who was worthy of joining civilization. She said, "You looked at my species and saw chaos and violence and a people who could not even stop fighting themselves. And you were right. We are all of those things. But we are also stubborn and creative and completely unwilling to accept that anything is impossible. You ignored us because you thought we had nothing to offer. Today we showed you different." Thyvan was silent for a long moment. "The council will want to discuss formal relations." He finally said, "There will be debates about your status and your rights and your place in the galactic order." "I am sure there will be," Elena replied, "and I am sure my people will have opinions about all of that. But right now I have wounded crew members who need medical attention and damaged ships that need repairs, and a species that needs to know that their sacrifice was worth something. So, if you will excuse me, I have work to do." She walked past him toward the door and then stopped. "One more thing," she said without turning around. "The next time your council decides to ignore a species because they seem too primitive or too chaotic or too dangerous, remember what happened here. Remember that we came uninvited and we fought your war and we won. And remember that we did it because you gave us no other choice." She left the observation deck, and Thyvan stood alone watching the human ships move through the debris field, saving lives and gathering their dead. Galactic Council had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. They had built an empire based on order and protocol and the careful management of lesser species. And, in a single day, a group of chaotic primitives from a forgotten world had changed everything. Humanity had arrived uninvited, and the galaxy would never be the same again. Far away on Earth Maria, Santa sat in her office surrounded by screens showing the news from the sun. She was old now, and her hands shook when she held her coffee cup, but her eyes were clear as she watched the footage of human ships dancing through an enemy that had terrified the galaxy for centuries. 40 years ago, she had detected a signal that proved humanity was not alone. Today, humanity had proven something far more important. They had proven that they belonged among the stars, and anyone who disagreed was welcome to try and stop them.